Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook. I'm back with yet another Reviewer's Log Supplemental to talk about things from the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which was episode 4, Memento Mori, that I just didn't talk about in my review, either because I didn't notice them or because I was going to talk about them, but then I forgot, which happens because I'm getting on in years, and stuff that other people bring up in the comments section, viewers like you. So there's a few things I want to get to. First thing I want to talk about is something that was brought up by Michael Strathmore, who is a viewer who brings up great points after every episode in the comments section of my videos. And he talked about how it's now been twice within 4 episodes that an enemy failed to detect the presence of a shuttlecraft in the theater, or in theater, which is a term they use in the military for an area in which a military engagement is taking place, whether it's a battle or, you know, other maneuverings. And yeah, he's right, they did. The aliens that were trying to protect the comet in an episode, which I think is 2 weeks ago now. Or was that the premiere episode? I don't remember. Anyway, twice now in 2 episodes, the Enterprise's adversary failed to detect the presence of a shuttlecraft around them, right? The first one was when Spock took the shuttlecraft and hid on the underside of like a piece of the comet from that episode, where they had to do something about the comet that was going to strike a planet. And when the Enterprise distracted the aliens, he came out of hiding from the underside of a piece of debris from the comet and flew it around the main body of the comet to break it up so that it would, you know, not hurt the planet. And he was successful at doing that because the aliens didn't detect him. Because, you know, they didn't want anybody messing with the comet, right? That's why they were engaging the Enterprise, and that's why the Enterprise had to distract them so that they wouldn't notice him doing it. And it's fine that they were distracted, but throughout the episode, they demonstrated that they could detect various things happening in the area. And they didn't detect the shuttle. They didn't detect what he was doing. I mean, they didn't, but does that make sense? I don't know. And, you know, quite frankly, the episode was just so good that I let it go. Because of course it occurred to me. But there's certain things that I'm willing to let go, and I didn't see the need to bring it up and nitpick over it. Which is not to say that bringing it up and nitpicking over it is bad. It wasn't on my list. I was going to let that one go and just let the story be serviced by that without commenting on it. But the problem is that now a second time they've done this same thing, right? Because in this episode, Memento Mori, Pike dispatches Spock and La'an in a shuttle to do some recon while they're trying to hide from the Gorn. And again, the Gorn, who were playing cat and mouse with the Enterprise the whole time and watching them very closely and sort of seemed to be right behind them at every move, didn't detect the shuttle. And it's like, what? How does that make any sense? I mean, Pike says, well, you know, we're in this brown nebula, whatever, to this brown dwarf, and sensors are hindered, and so they won't detect it. But they had to hide and, you know, keep moving or whatever to not be found. So it isn't that sensors didn't work at all. So why didn't they detect the shuttle, where they would have detected something that the Enterprise had done if they had made a move that made them visible, like flying around and trying to do a recon mission? So now it's twice in 4 episodes, and you got to go, okay, that should not be the case. They shouldn't be depicting that. It doesn't make sense. So hopefully they won't do that anymore. The other thing that Michael brought up is an interesting point that I forgot to mention, which is, what about the poor colony in this episode that the Enterprise was trying to bring the filter to so that they could have breathable air, which was not going to be a thing anymore without the filter. The filter done blowed up. And there was no mention of what they're going to do now for this colony. And I think they had said they were a very short time away from having, air that wasn't breathable. So I can't be sure, but I think what we've seen before in Star Trek is that when something like this was going on, when they were on a mission to help somebody in a similar way, there was a redundancy. In other words, they would have two filters, so that in case something happened on one in transit, or in case that when they got there it somehow did not work, they would have the backup. So there was no redundancy mentioned in this episode. So that's, a poor showing on behalf of the writers. They didn't demonstrate that they had a redundancy in place. They didn't say anything about, well, now that the filter is destroyed, we're going to have to go to the backup plan, which is not necessarily another filter, which it could have been, but a backup plan of distributing personal breathers that the colonies can use for a few days once the filter that they have does in fact fail, which will buy us time to get another ship out here with a new filter, since this one didn't make it. So they don't mention that. And that's sloppy on behalf of the writers. They should have mentioned something about how they were going to complete the mission, which was to keep the colonists from suffocating. But they don't mention that. So I don't know, maybe they'll mention it in the future. They could always do that, but somehow I doubt it's going to occur. And that's sloppy on behalf of the writers, and they really should improve. Now, another point about this episode that I missed because I had forgotten about it mostly is something that Sean Ferrick over at Trek Culture brought up in his Ups and Downs video about this episode. He brought up the fact that the whole scenario of this episode, where the Enterprise is playing cat and mouse with an enemy by hiding in a spatial anomaly, was very reminiscent of the Deep Space Nine episode Starship Down. Now, I had mentioned that it was reminiscent of Balance of Terror, which I believe Sean also noted, but I failed to mention that it was like the episode Starship Down because I forgot all about that episode. But Sean noticed it, and the similarities were many between this episode and that one. And also, there were similarities between plot points in this episode and the episode of The Next Generation called Disaster. Now, it wasn't as much of a thing there because the similarities were not as numerous. It's just that there were plot points in that episode that mirrored plot points in this one. And specifically, I'm talking about how the crew of the Enterprise in the TNG episode Disaster were all separated from each other and from other parts of the ship by something that happened on the ship, a disaster, if you will, and had to improvise in order to solve problems, one of which was something was going wrong in a cargo bay, and they had to vent the thing in order to not die. It was Geordi and Dr. Crusher, and they had to hang on for dear life in order not to get blown into space when they vented the cargo bay to get rid of a problem that was there. And interestingly, they didn't put on EV suits, which you got to give Enterprise credit. I mean, which you have to give Strange New Worlds credit for doing, because that would have been the right way to go, assuming they had access to those in the cargo bay on the Enterprise D as they did in the cargo bay of the Enterprise in Strange New Worlds. That would have been cool. But yeah, so the same exact scenario occurs in that episode as occurs in this one. And it wasn't the overall plot of this episode, but it was part of it. And so it really looks like the writers just stole that scenario, the solution to that scenario, as well as the entire premise of the overall episode from previous iterations of Star Trek, in order not to believe that they stole it outright, which would be really bad. You'd have to believe that they just aren't aware of these episodes, which is certainly possible, but that's also not a great look for these producers and writers, that they are not aware of what came before. I mean, either way, reproducing old episodes, just not a good look. Deliberately, by accident, not a good look. And to be honest, I'm having trouble imagining how they inadvertently repeated the cargo bay scenario from the TNG episode Disaster because it's so specific. I can buy that they said, hey, you know, The Hunt for the Red October and about 100 other movies where they've had a cat and mouse game between ships or even like fighter jets or planes, and how that's like a theme in literature. Let's do our own version of that, which would of course have been okay. That's something that occurs and it's normal. So I would give them the benefit of the doubt on that one, that they weren't deliberately copying Starship Down, or for that matter, Balance of Terror, which I believe I mentioned in my review, or for that matter, Star Trek II, which I believe I mentioned in my review. So you can let that one go because it's kind of a thing, it's a trope, and to use a trope is a different thing from completely copying the premise of a single episode. But they may have copied the premise completely from that single episode, we don't know. And again, it looks like to me that they did in fact copy the cargo bay scenario from the TNG episode Disaster directly. So bad form, bad look, and I hope they don't keep doing stuff like this. Now I want to get to something that I had said during my review of this episode, about how I didn't think we had seen a case where someone who had been part of a mind meld with a Vulcan had seen into their mind versus having their mind seen into. But I think I'm incorrect about that, because I'm remembering that Picard retained things in his mind that he got from his mind meld with Sarek, and he let Spock experience those things at the end of Unification Part 2. So that means that he did, in fact, pick up things from Sarek's mind when their minds were joined. He did, in fact, experience what was happening in Sarek's mind. So I was incorrect to say that I didn't think we'd seen that before. So I just wanted to correct myself there. Now, I want to get to the biggest thing in this episode, which also has to do with my review, because in my review I talked about how, you know, the use of the Gorn in this episode was a potential contradiction of continuity and canon. What I had said in my review was that I wasn't going to make a big deal of it because it seemed to me like they handled it well enough where you could get by and continue the premise that the Gorn showing up in TOS was not the flat out unquestionable first contact with the Gorn, such that you could get away with having them in Strange New Worlds as a known species. And I said that because they said things in the episode like, you know, people who have seen the Gorn haven't lived, and no one who, you know, very few people, if anyone, who have seen them in person have lived. And so you're thinking, okay, so they can still get away with saying by the time of TOS that nobody had seen them before, even though they're depicting them as having been encountered in an earlier era. But the fact of the matter is they screwed it up because the language in the episode arena is so specific that there's no way around it. Captain Kirk flat out says in like a log phrases similar to, I've now been forced to confront an alien from a species that the person who put me against him, or the entity that put me against him, referred to as a Gorn. So he very much makes a note of the fact that the Federation is entirely unfamiliar with the Gorn, which, you know, as I said, can be determined from the specific word choices that he makes, that the writers made in that episode. I'm about to engage someone from a species called the Gorn, who I've been told is from a species called the Gorn, or who was referred to as the Gorn by the people who put me here on this planet to confront him, which very clearly indicates that he'd never heard of the Gorn before. So not having seen them is one thing, but it's clear in the dialogue from this episode that the Federation has never heard, or that Kirk has never heard of the Gorn before. So that just can't be, right? There's no way that Spock went through the events of this episode of Strange New Worlds and served with La'an, who experienced the Gorn in person as a child, didn't know about the Gorn by the time of Arena. And if Spock knew, How is it that Kirk could get away with saying, oh, this species, they're called the Gorn, I think. I think that's what they're called. You know, that's basically what he says. The Gorn, yeah, the Gorn. That's what they're called, I'm told. How can it be that he wouldn't know about them? And it doesn't seem like it's classified. Other people on the Enterprise in Strange New Worlds seem to know about the Gorn. It's in a record that Pike is reading, which could be a classified record, but you know, they don't say that. And then of course there's the whole Gorn skeleton in Lorca's office, which, you know, you could write that off as saying it was an unknown species, that he had the skeleton of an unknown species. But there's no way to escape the fact that the Federation, unless you're going to say, well, the Federation knew, Kirk just had never heard of them, even though Spock did, even though other people who served with him did. Kirk didn't. That would be like me, you know, saying that, oh, my wife told me that she watched a program on something called Netflix. You know, like everybody knows about it, but somehow I don't, you know. That's just ridiculous. So, I mean, of course, there are people in the far-flung reaches of the world who haven't heard of Netflix, right? But Kirk was the captain of a starship, you know, the idea that he hadn't heard of the Gorn when they had been encountered before with his ship by his first officer is just ridiculous. And so it begs the question, why didn't they just use another species? Why not just make up a new one? Why not just dig out another species that's already in existence? Why did they choose a species that they can't get away with trying to pretend, you know, the use of which doesn't screw up the continuity when it clearly does? And there are only so many ways to answer that question. One of them is they're inept and they don't know the history, which they absolutely should. And the other is they do know, but they don't give a shit. And neither of those things are a good look. And this is killing me because I think a lot of the things about this show are really well done. I really enjoy watching the show. I think it's very good. As compared to Discovery and Picard alone, never mind that it's good on its own without that comparison. But as I've said before, from the beginning, I had concerns that these things were going to happen. And people would say, well, we don't know what happened on the Enterprise during that era. We don't know Pike's history. We don't know what happened to Spock during those years. So how can they screw up canon? Because they can just make it up and it should be fine. Yeah, but they could screw up all these other peripheral things about the era. And that's what I said at the time when people would say that to me. And lo and behold, they're doing it. And it's bad. So I think they're on the right track. I think they've got their head in the right, you know, place. Their mind seems to be in the game, but they're just missing these things, or they're making these choices on purpose that they don't have to make. And it's like, why stop it? Just stop it. And part of that, you know, is I don't like feeling like they don't care about me as a viewer. That's very hard to take, you know, to know that an entity that you're giving my money to directly now, which wasn't the case with Star Trek before, doesn't care that these things bother me and doesn't care that it makes me feel as though they don't care enough about me to get it right. So I really want them to get these things right going forward, because I think this show is really good and it could be excellent. It's bordering on excellent. It's good to very good. It could be excellent, which is not the case for Discovery or Picard without massive, massive overhauls. So I think they're almost there. They just need to stop doing this dumb stuff. Now, another thing I want to talk about that has to do with this, the continuity issue, is the aesthetic of Strange New Worlds. I am finding that the new bridge design is growing on me. I'm finding that I like it quite a bit. It's sleek, it's cool, and the references, you know, visual references to the original bridge are there. They do have switches and knobs and gumdrop buttons on the consoles, and I think that's great. You know, the captain's chair is reminiscent of Kirk's chair, or in this case, Pike's chair, which there was a difference between the two, from the cage to Where No Man Has Gone Before anyway. So it's reminiscent of the chair that we all know. It's very close to it. The displays on the screens are, I think, appropriately similar to the displays on the screens of the original bridge, although these, of course, are actual computer-generated displays versus cardboard, you know, slats behind a set piece. So I think they did a good job there. I think they've done a good job of blending the modern with the, antique here in making the Enterprise bridge look like it was done with modern, tools, production tools, but at the same time is faithful to the aesthetic of the original bridge. The problem is they didn't honor that aesthetic as much as they could have. And by that, I don't mean to say that it doesn't look exactly the same and that's bad. It didn't need to look exactly the same. The bridge that we've got is good the way it is with a few tweaks that I would have made. There's no reason they have to have that very obvious gray trim on the turbo lift doors. This doesn't need to be there. It shouldn't be there. Take it out. It doesn't have anything to do with making the bridge look not from the 60s. It doesn't need to be there. Take it out. There's no reason that the center console, the nav console and whatever, has to be curved. It goes like this. Why? It's supposed to be straight. Why do they have to curve it? It's unnecessary. Why is there a light strip trim on it? Why? Doesn't need to be there. Why is the railing that goes around the bridge trimmed with strip lights? It doesn't need to be there. Back to the chair for a second. Why is it on a stage with two separate levels? The chair itself is on a platform in the original series, right? But then they've now taken that platform and put it on top of a double level stage. Why? What has that got to do with not making it look like it's from the 60s? Nothing. And each level is also trimmed in a strip light. Why? It didn't need to be done. And I think they should have not done those things. And I think they could have done a better job of blending the past with the present and kept it more faithful to the original without making it look like it was made in the 60s. And as an example of that, I want to show you a video that was made a number of years ago, I guess, and put up on Vimeo by a user called Kevin George. And it's a tech demo, basically, of what it would look like if you took the original series bridge and updated it with modern technology. Now, to be fair, in this video, the chair is changed, the captain's chair. It doesn't look as similar to the original chair as the one in Enterprise does. So I would have gone with the chair that they've used in Strange New Worlds versus the chair that's used in this video. But other than that, the changes made to the Enterprise bridge in this video leave the bridge looking more like the original bridge does than the Strange New Worlds bridge does. And yes, I'm aware that that's what's behind me as we're talking about this. And I just wish they had gone this route instead of the route that they went. So if you watch this video, you can see that the video screens have all been, digitized versus analog. And they did trim the bridge doors in gray, but it's a little more subtle than the gray trim that's been added to the Strange New Worlds bridge doors. But, like I said, they changed the captain's chair, but the rest of it is extremely faithful to the original bridge. In fact, it uses the same space, whereas the bridge in Strange New Worlds is, a different space in terms of dimension. They didn't alter the space in terms of the dimensions for this video, which Strange New Worlds did. And they kept, it seems to me, more of the same elements in their updated version than Strange New Worlds did. And I would have preferred this to what we have, as would, I think, most of the people who complain about how this bridge looks. When we say things about this bridge, people say, what do you want? An exact recreation like on Star Trek Continues? Nobody would watch that. It looks like it's from the 60s. They weren't going to use the cardboard sets. Nobody wants that. Nobody's calling for that. But the update didn't have to look as far removed from the original as this update does. As I said, it retains elements of the original, which is great, but it's more removed from the original than it needs to be. They could have been even more faithful, and they weren't. Why? That's what annoys us. that it was possible to blend them even better than they did, as evidenced by the video from Kevin George, but they just chose not to. They chose to go overboard, trimming crap in lights that didn't need to be there, going overboard with the trim on the doors, curving the center console, putting the captain's chair, which is already on a pedestal, on a double level stage. Why? Oh, and let's talk about the view screen. The view screen is the length of the bridge. You know, the front, it's a circle, but you know what I'm saying? It runs the entire wall at the front of the bridge. I understand they wanted to make it look modern and not rinky-dink like the bridge in the 60s with the little 40-inch screen. But like the whole length of the bridge, like why? Why is it that big? That wasn't necessary. Why does it go from the ceiling to the floor? Why does it go from wall to wall? Not necessary. They could have modernized it without going that far. And that's what bothers people like me. That's why people like me complain about this bridge, among other things that have to do with visual continuity, because it goes too far. Updating is cool. It goes too far. And people need to understand the difference. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say in this reviewer's log supplemental. So I'm going to get out of here, and I'll be back, of course, with a review of episode 5 and probably another supplemental reviewer's log entry thereafter when people like Michael Strathmore and Sean Ferrick bring things up in the comments section in the case of Michael, on ups and downs in the case of Sean Ferrick. But until then, I wish you peace and long life.